The basic idea of President Trump's national security strategy is we're so powerful, we can dictate terms. We should not be limited by quaint things like the United Nations or treaties or even normal relations with other countries. And within our own hemisphere, we're absolutely dominant, and we can tell the countries in our hemisphere what to do or not to do. And as we see in the case of Venezuela, we can threaten them, amass troops, perhaps overthrow a government with impunity. So the idea of the national security strategy is that the United States is the most powerful country in the world and should remain so. And by dint of being the most powerful country in the world, it remains strong by dictating the terms to other countries.
This is an important framing from Sachs because it captures something deeper than just one administration. There's been a long-standing belief in Washington that raw power alone creates security. But history tells us that dominance without restraint usually creates resistance, not stability. If you look at how great powers have overextended, from Britain after World War I to the Soviet Union in the late Cold War, the common thread is the assumption that strength equals control. Real security, especially in a multipolar world, comes from legitimacy, restraint, and diplomacy, not from assuming others will simply comply.
Well, my critique is that this is all a bit of a delusion. We are not all powerful. In fact, what is clearly evident in the case of the Ukraine war is that the United States could not dictate, though it tried to for 30 years, the expansion of NATO to Russia's border. Russia said no, it came to blows, it's not going to happen.
This is one of those uncomfortable realities policymakers avoid admitting. Great powers have red lines, whether we like them or not. Ignoring those red lines doesn't make them disappear. It just increases the risk of conflict. Ukraine is a reminder that deterrence has limits.
The United States cannot dictate terms in other parts of the world either. We can keep ourselves safe. We should deal with other countries in a mutually respectful way in order to enhance our security. And we should drop the delusions that we can overthrow governments at will or tell the Latin American countries, you can't deal with China, for example, another sub-theme of this strategy, because all of that is arrogance that's going to lead to a downfall, not the kind of prudence that leads to real security.
Prudence is an old-fashioned word, but it's central to statecraft. Most stable periods in history weren't built on dominance alone, but on restraint. When restraint disappears, instability tends to follow, not immediately, but inevitably.
The Monroe Doctrine is usually stated in shorthand as the United States is in charge of the Western Hemisphere in some sense.
It's important to hear how this idea actually originated. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't initially about control. It was about preventing renewed European colonization. Over time, though, the meaning shifted, and that shift had consequences.
But what President Monroe said when he sent his seventh message to the Congress in 1823 is three stipulations. First, and this was in the aftermath of the wars of independence of the other countries of the Americas, that the newly independent countries of the Americas who had gained independence from the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, that Europe should not reclaim those colonies. In other words, the era of European colonization or empire building in the Americas was over. Second, that the Europeans should not introduce their military into the Americas. And third, which is almost entirely forgotten in our time, is the reciprocity that the United States, under the Monroe Doctrine, declares we will not interfere in Europe's wars and in Europe's security.
That reciprocal promise is rarely mentioned today. Once reciprocity disappears, trust erodes. And when trust erodes between major powers, everything starts being interpreted as a threat, even defensive actions.
So the Monroe Doctrine was actually stated in 1823 as a reciprocal doctrine. You stay out of our backyard and we'll stay out of yours when it comes to military and security issues. Don't threaten us. We won't get involved in
how did we get 850 military installations in 80 countries around the world?
Well, because we're not very good at reciprocity. We're very good at telling other countries what to do, but not actually behaving according to the rules.
This is where credibility matters. International order isn't enforced by force alone, it's sustained by consistency. When standards are applied selectively, countries start looking for alternatives, not confrontation.
So that we have set on others. In other words, do not do unto others in the way that we dictate to them what they should do to us. We say, stay out of our hemisphere, don't even come close, don't dream of threatening us anywhere in the Americas. But if we want to have a military base in Ukraine, that's none of Russia's business. If we want to arm Taiwan, a part of China, that's none of China's business. In other words, we can say, oh, don't even come within thousands of miles. Don't even have a port servicing operation in Panama by a Hong Kong company. That's a threat to the United States. But we can have 750 or 800 military bases in around 80 countries of the world on anyone's borders without anyone telling us what to do. So the idea of the golden rule does not apply under the U.S. rubric.
You can see the consequences of that thinking today. Nations aren't rejecting cooperation, they're rejecting asymmetry. That distinction explains why non-aligned blocs are quietly growing rather than collapsing.
Now, what happened is, again, the U.S. has a particular history. It has been an imperial power from the start, but for the first hundreds of years, the empire building was on the North American continent. Right. It was on defeating Native American populations or attacking the Mexican government and Mexican territory to wrest a lot of the southwest of the United States, California for the United States, and so forth. That empire building of the United States lasted through the 19th century.
This historical context matters because empires rarely see themselves as empires in real time. Expansion is usually framed as necessity or security. Only later does the cost become clear.
It ended around 1890, and then immediately the United States said, okay, now we build an international empire. And it toppled the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1890s. And then in 1898, on very dubious grounds, went to war with a very weak and failing Spanish Empire and captured the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba.
These moments shaped how the world views American power even today. Memory matters in geopolitics. Countries remember interventions long after the justifications fade.
And basically held on to those territories. Cuba technically gained independence, but under something called the Platt Amendment, the United States asserted its right to intervene at will in Cuban affairs for decades afterwards. And that's why we still have a patch of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, where that naval base, that base and prison is held until this day. That came from the conquests of the United States in 1898. Soon after the Spanish-American War victory, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a real imperialist after all, declared his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, something very different. He said not only should Europe stay away, but he also said that the U.S. would be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, quite explicitly, that we could go in to clean up bad behavior. one of the reasons, interestingly, why he said it is that Venezuela, of all countries, because we're at it again, in 1902 defaulted on its foreign debt. And the British and the French actually shelled the harbor of Caracas to get the Venezuelans to restart their debt payments. So Teddy Roosevelt said, we'll take care of that problem, not the Europeans. We'll be the policemen of our own hemisphere. But the Roosevelt corollary became a license for the Marines landing wherever they wanted, in Central America, in Cuba, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in repeated military interventions and regime change operations.
Repeated intervention often creates the very instability it claims to solve. You can see echoes of this pattern across multiple regions over the last 70 years.
Overthrowing governments. This led to a lot of instability, and when the sixth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt gained the White House, Franklin Roosevelt, and he came into the White House on March 4th, 1933, he declared a good neighbor policy. He repudiated his distant cousin's corollary, and he said, we will not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries in our hemisphere. And that was a principle that Roosevelt held to, and then it became part of a charter, the Charter of the Organization of American States, which was adopted in 1948, which says explicitly in part of the charter, Article 19, no country should interfere in the internal affairs of other countries.
That principle still exists on paper, but enforcement depends on political will. When rules become optional for the powerful, they eventually stop functioning for everyone.
In the hemisphere. Well, along comes Donald Trump. His corollary is the Theodore Roosevelt corollary 10 times over.
But let me
it
get
says
this.
Not only are we the policemen, not only can we boss other countries around, but it's not only military issues where we're the policemen. We can tell other countries, you make contracts only with American companies, and you do not make contracts or trade or investments with countries we don't like.
This is where economic power replaces military force. But even here, limits exist. The more pressure applied, the more incentive other countries have to build parallel systems.
Subtext China. So Trump is amping it up, telling other countries, we're going to run the whole show of our hemisphere. And this military buildup and killing people in boats off the coast of Venezuela is the application of what is called the Trump corollary. It's a lot of hubris. It's a lot of arrogance. It doesn't sit well with the rest of the world, and it's not going to work because it's a huge exaggeration of American power.
That may be the central warning here. Power isn't just about capability. It's about perception and sustainability. The world today is far less tolerant of unilateral control than it was even 20 years ago. What Sachs is really arguing is not for retreat, but for recalibration. History shows that nations preserve influence longer when they respect limits. Ignoring those limits doesn't project strength. It exposes fragility.